Hi, and thanks for watching this Acumatica video on setting up an inventory item. Today we're going to go into a deep dive on the inventory item profile. So let's get started. So we'll go into inventory and stock items, and we'll hit plus. And this is a stock item. A stock item has the ability to carry inventory levels, to carry cost with those inventory levels, and to be valued on your books and in stock. A non-stock item, which we're not going into today, a non-stock item is for services, expenses, charges, but for things that you don't purchase and then sell again. For things that are not physically in inventory and stored for any period of time and then sold. So we'll get started by creating an item. We'll call this a widget. We'll give it a description. Acumatica has the ability to have product managers and product workgroup managers so that you can define an area of expertise in your company that can handle these products for purchasing purposes. So throughout the software, the product manager field and workgroup fields are visible so that when you're doing, for example, replenishment, that particular product manager or workgroup can filter on their items of expertise and create purchase orders and handle their buying. So the item has a status. Currently, because we're creating a new item, we're assuming that it's going to be active. But you have the options to provide no sales, no purchase, no request restrictions, purchase request, or to mark it inactive or for deletion. So these are different preferences you can use. If an item you know is going to get discontinued, then you can, for example, select no purchases but still sell out at stock. That's a good example. Item class. Acumatica has an item class, and at first glance it's a good way to categorize your items, but it does a lot more than that. So let's select an item class first. So we'll call this a toy. And one of the things you notice is that Acumatica brings in all of these default settings. The default settings come from the item class. Let's take a look at it. First off, item classes can be nested, so you can have different categories within categories. So in the example of toys, they're part of the consumer item class. And once again, you can see all these fields. These are the fields that got pulled in when we selected this item class into that item. So the item type, the valuation, tax category, we'll go through some of these items when we get back to the inventory profile. But the unit of measure and a number of other things, price management, the price manager and stuff. There are some other options that are part of the item in that item class and will always be. So for example, allow negative quantity. Acumatica allows negative quantity, and it's very helpful in situations where you have point of sale, where you need that item regardless of whether it's in stock or not. The customer has the item in their hand, and you're certainly going to make a sale. So there's different reasons for that, but an allow negative quantity is defined here in the item class, and it's turned on and off for all the items that are attached to this class. Whereas these particular settings are only pulled in at the time of selecting that item class when you're creating the item. So it's important to note that. Replenishment settings, these are the replenishment settings that will be pulled in for the item class. But we have a demand calculation. We have two options. Again, these options in this setting will affect any items that are associated with this item class. So if I change it, it'll affect it. The item class settings create demand based on the availability calculation. We're going to take a look at that in a second. Hard demand only takes items that are on shipments and that are allocated. So that's what creates the demand when we're calculating it for replenishment purposes. That's why it's on the screen. And this replenishment settings, the ID, the seasonality, and everything, we'll take a look at that when we get into the inventory profile. Before we move forward, let's go back to the availability calculation. Acumatica has the ability to create different calculation rules that you can define here. Each of these checkboxes indicate that when items are in this status or on this document, the calculation will be used to create availability. So for example, this deducts quantity on sales orders. So if you have 5 on a sales order and you have 10 in stock, then now you have only 5 available because there's 5 on sales order. These are on quantity shipped, quantity allocated, and there's a screen called Inventory Allocation Details, which highlights this really, really well. So if we go out and we go into our stock item list and we open up an item, an existing item, and we look at allocation details, this screen gives you a really good idea of where this item is throughout the system, what documents it's on. So you could double click and drill into, there's quantity 1, for example, on a purchase order, which was created by a sales order. There's another 3 on a couple of purchase orders, there's 5 in another one, and so on. Under quantity for plan type, this shows your total additions, what I have coming inbound, and what I have going outbound, the deductions. So you can see the different categories. And if we go back to our calculator, you can see how these areas are thrown into the calculation. And the reason there's nothing here is because nothing is showing for the quantities. We have purchase prepared and purchase orders, but they're not included in the calculation for this particular item. So this particular item uses a calculation rule which doesn't have purchase orders checked, which is why even though these quantities are showing, they're not figured into the calculation. So let's get back to our item class. Sub-item restrictions. So Acumatica has the ability to do row-level security. So you can actually take certain items and restrict them so that certain users can't see them or work with them. So that's what this is. These are the different groups that this item belongs to. Attributes are custom fields that you can create throughout the system. There's a global repository that you can create. And if I wanted this particular set of items that are associated with the item class 300 toys to see any of these attributes, I can add them here. Let's say, for example, color. So now going forward, any items in the 300 toys will see the attribute, the custom field called toys. And we'll save that. We'll see it later. And this is related to service management. Whether this item is part of the equipment management, our service management feature allows you to track items for your customers and determine their maintenance schedules and their warranties and stuff like that. So this determines what equipment class. Are they a part? Is it a model equipment, component, or is it just something consumed as the result of a field service order? Okay, so that's item class. So let's go back to our stock item. This particular item is a finished good. It could be a component or a sub-assembly, depending upon if you manufacture, if it's part of a kit or something. The valuation method, we have standard and average, first in, first out, and specific. Specific being for serialized items. The tax category, so this is how this item is categorized for sales tax purposes. This is very helpful because some items are tax exempt in certain states, so you may need a different tax category than just a taxable good. This is the posting class, and if you take a look at our other video about posting, and we have another video out there about how this posting class interacts in Acumatica when selling the item on a sales order. It's a good idea to take a look at that. But this has all your GL settings in it. This is whether it's lot or serial classed. In this case, we're not tracking it. This is the country of origin, if you want to track that. So here's our warehouse defaults. When we put this item on a purchase document and receive it, when we put it on an order and ship it, where do we get this item from? Typically, the default is the wholesale warehouse, and we issue or ship it from row 1, shelf 1, and we receive it into a receiving bin. In this particular case, we receive it into an area and then we put it away later. The most common usage of this is that we actually put it away in the same place we issue it from, but different warehouses have different methodologies. So here is our unit of measure for the base. The base unit can't be changed later. This is how you store it in inventory. So in this particular case, we're storing it in inventory in a measure of eaches. Our default sales measure is also eaches, and our purchase measure is eaches. Now, having said that, this is my purchase measure. Maybe I want to change this because perhaps I buy this in a box of 10. Now, in order to get box of 10 showing here, I would create a conversion, select box of 10, multiply by 10. Here's the conversion method. And then now I can go over here and select a box of 10. This would be my default measure. I don't have to leave it this way. I can play it by ear, and when I'm creating my purchase order, change the measure from each to box of 10. But in this case, we're selecting the default. This is my physical inventory parameter. So when I do a physical inventory, and we have another video on this, but when I do a physical inventory, what is the inventory cycle I want this grouped to? So if it's attached to the cycle, and I do my physical inventory based on a type that uses the cycle as its definition for the items I'm going to be counting, then that's where this would come in. Same thing with ABC codes and movement classes, although ABC codes and movement classes can be dynamically updated to the item based on their ABC and movement class calculations. However, you can select a specific ABC or movement and fix it so that it never updates. And once again, we have a video on ABC and movement classes. Take a look at that. So here's my pricing tab. So this is the price class that this particular item belongs to. This is useful for categorizing items into different price groups. So for example, I can take any item in the price class of widget, and I can do different rules for it. Rather than create rules to every single individual item that's part of the widget class, I can say all items in the widget class, for example, get a 10% discount. Or I could say all the items in this widget price class, for example, get a 10% discount if it's associated with maybe a specific customer or a group of customers, if customer price class is 2. So that's how that works. And we have a product manager and product work group. We also have a price work group and a pricing manager. And these are filters you can use to create your pricing worksheets. So for example, I can only reprice items that are associated with a specific price manager or group. If you're using commissions in Acumatica, this would be subject to the commission. If it's unchecked, the item is excluded from the commission calculations. Minimum markup percentage allows you to maintain a certain threshold. So for example, if I select 2% and a salesperson tries to sell this at cost, the system can take certain actions, and there's preferences in the system to enforce this 2% minimum markup. The markup percentage is used in our sales pricing engine so that you can use the markup percentage, whatever's defined in that item, and say, all right, well, I typically mark this up 10%. So the system can reset the sales price based on that 10% that's defined here. And we have another video on the pricing rules, so take a look at that. This is the manufactured suggested retail price. This is more of a storage field, although you can use the MSRP also in the sales worksheets to calculate off of. And then my default price could be, for example, be $90. Now, the last cost is something that we typically import in. And when we're doing initial implementations, we may bring in a last cost so that when we create our purchase order for the very first time, the system will look at this last cost and use that price so that purchasing managers aren't starting blind with zero prices as they purchase these items. So the manufacturing tab, we talked about that in another demo. So we won't go into detail, but here's where you can set up your replenishments and stuff specifically for manufacturing. So Acumatica supports multiple warehouses. And in creating this item, because our default was the wholesale default warehouse, has created a warehouse detail entry. And when you look at this, it actually contains specific settings that you can override or pull in from the item, but specific to that warehouse. So for example, you can make it inactive in a certain warehouse. Maybe I don't sell that item in that particular warehouse. Maybe it's not allowed in that state, for example, or I just want to discontinue it because it's not selling a lot. The storage defaults, of course, they'd be different. Keep in mind that I may have multiple warehouses across the board for this particular item. I may override my physical inventory. Maybe I source this item for this warehouse differently. I have a different country of origin. I can override my GL accounts. I can, of course, have different replenishment information. You can see that here. Seasonality may be a big factor in the replenishment of this item in a certain area of the country, but maybe not so in another area of the country. So you can change your seasonality. You can change how you replenish it. And again, we'll go into this a little bit in greater detail. And these are my preferred parameters. I may buy this from another vendor in a different warehouse because maybe that vendor's closer. So maybe I need to source it from a closer vendor. This is the vendor lead times, their economic order quantities. And that gets us into our vendor details. So specific to this item and not taking into consideration anything I may override in the warehouse details, I can have different vendors here and I can default those vendors. So this is the default vendor that I use to purchase this item. I can add any additional lead times above and beyond how long this item takes to maybe source or build if it's a special order item. This particular vendor takes 2 days to get it, and maybe they have an economic order quantity of 20. Don't bother me unless you're ordering 20 of them, for example. Here's the attributes. Notice we have color in there now because we changed our item class. And this particular attribute has a drop down for different colors. So we'll set this to blue. That's what the widget is. Sales categories are used heavily for e-commerce purposes. So you can have a different sales category than an item class. So I can say, for example, this is a consumer good. And later you can use these kinds of preferences in the Commerce Edition. These are my packaging options. I can define my weight and what that unit of measure is, the volume and what that unit of measure is. And I have the ability in Acumatica to automatically package this item based on weight, quantity, or weight and volume. Now what Acumatica does is it takes a look at these values and it takes a look at the package you're trying to put it in, and it determines how many of these packages you might need, or it'll determine the package, the optimum package. So, but typically we use a manual. This is very helpful for smaller items that maybe spill from box to box, but for bigger items that are oddly shaped, not so helpful. And of course you can pack it separately. You can define that here. Cross-reference gives me the ability to use a different SKU or code and still pull up this item. So maybe I can pull this item up using 10005. And in doing so, I can actually change the unit of measure if I want to, and the description when it pulls it up. You have some options there. The other thing you could do is you can use, for example, a specific customer part number. So maybe this particular customer, ABC Holdings, likes to order this part. Maybe it's their part that you sourced for them and designed for them, but that's their part number, and they pull it up as ABC's widget. So every time you use their part number, this particular item will come up and it'll override the description too. Replenishment info, we started to talk about this. We're going to go into greater detail in another video, but these particular parameters give you the ability to keep this item in stock. So there's a few settings here that I want to go over. When I'm looking to get this item into stock, first off, going a little backwards here, we purchase this item. So whenever we determine that this item is low, and then we determine how much we need to bring into stock, we're going to create a purchase order here. But we have other options. We can manufacture, we can transfer it from another warehouse. We can perform a drop shipment on this by default all the time. It's on a sales order, it can automatically drop ship, or purchase to order, meaning I create a purchase order specific for that sales order, but in this case, purchase. And then we have fixed reorder quantity and min-max. Min-max gives us the ability to, when we hit our min, to order up to the max with all the other calculations if there's other items that are coming in on purchase orders or other items on sales orders. So it'll factor that in as well. Or fixed reorder quantity, where we hit that reorder point and we order the economic order quantity for that vendor. So it'll just order that in bulk to get it to where it is. So if the economic order quantity is quantity 100, but we need 150, the system's going to order 200. If we're doing a transfer, we need a replenishment warehouse. So we'd select that here. Our service level and our demand forecast allow us to have the system analyze the sales and determine what we need for our mins. So if I set this to moving average and I select maybe 3 months, the system will go back 3 months and calculate the sales. And based on keeping this item in stock 84% of the time, so in other words, every time a customer orders it, 84% of the time, I'll have it on hand. The system will determine what the reorder point is for this item. And it can put that number in there so that later when you do your replenishment, it'll use that reorder point. So service management, again, came from the item class, but this is the equipment class that we put it in. So if you defer this item, the revenue for this item, you can pick a deferral code here. So let's say 12 months evenly. So when I sell this item, I don't want to recognize the revenue right away. Instead, I want to recognize it over 12 months. And the system can create a deferral schedule and then recognize the revenue evenly over 12 months in this case. These are my general ledger accounts. These GL accounts were pulled in by my item class as a default. And they're used based on the posting class. The posting class has some settings as to whether or not to use those or to use the settings in the posting class. So again, we have another video on this. And then our restriction groups. We talked about how this item can be part of a specific restriction group where certain users can see and use this item and sell this item and purchase this item, and based on the rule it's in. And again, this is part of row-level security. Not something that a lot of customers use, but it is definitely a powerful feature if you need it. And then we have a description area for the item where we can write up a long description. We can use HTML and give a visual description of this item with all sorts of formatting. So that's it. That's a deep dive into the inventory item profile. Doesn't cover everything, but certainly gives you a lot of insight as to Acumatica's inventory item profile and how to create it. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching.